Hi, my name is Jim Cummins and I work at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. Over the last 25 or so years, there has been large-scale immigration into Canada. One of the consequences of that is that in the major Canadian cities, there are large numbers of students who are learning English or French as a second language. For example, in Toronto and Vancouver, more than half the students in the school system come from non-English speaking backgrounds. In Montreal, it's maybe 40% of the students in the school system come from non-French or non-English speaking backgrounds. And obviously one of the issues that this raises is, what do schools need to do to ensure that all students have an equal chance to succeed academically? How do we help students to acquire the language of instruction and catch up academically? And a particular aspect of this is, what do school leaders need to know in order to help students to catch up academically and organize the school as a learning environment where not only the students are learning what they need to learn that's in the curriculum, but also teachers have the opportunity to acquire the kinds of skills that they need to help students to succeed. And so when we look at the debates that have gone on in Canada and elsewhere, obviously in many parts of Europe and the United States also, one of the issues that comes up is what research is available to help us understand the kinds of instruction that will help students to catch up academically. When we look at the challenges for students, they need to acquire the language of instruction, but at the same time, they also need to acquire the content. They need to acquire the science knowledge, the mathematics knowledge, the social studies knowledge. And so how can they acquire that knowledge when their knowledge of the language of instruction is still at a very early stage? And so these issues have been debated for a long time, and one of the typical responses in many contexts has been to see the challenge as one of just adding extra capacity to the schools. So if we have a larger number of students who are learning the second language, then we add on specialized language teachers. And so these little satellites fixes are put into place. But that doesn't really address the issue when we look at what the research is saying. And when we look at what the research is saying, it's obviously essential that if principals are going to provide leadership to their teachers in the schools, they need to know what the research is saying. So let's look at a couple of things that come out of the research. First of all, there's a big difference between the challenges involved for students in acquiring everyday conversational skills in a second language and the kinds of language that they're expected to acquire in school. There are major differences between these two kinds of language. In everyday contexts, we use high-frequency words, we use common grammatical expressions. We communicate meaning not just by the words and sentences we use, but also by facial expressions, gestures. There's usually a concrete context. We can point to things that help us to communicate meaning. But in schools, the language that we expect students to learn and the language that's in textbooks and in classrooms tends to involve far more low-frequency words, far more grammatical expressions that we almost never use in everyday language. For example, we use the passive voice a lot in written text and when we're talking about science knowledge or mathematics knowledge, whereas we hardly ever use the passive voice in everyday conversation. And one implication of this is that it's more challenging for students to acquire academic knowledge of a language than it is to acquire the everyday conversational skills. And when we look at the trajectories that are involved, typically immigrant background students can pick up conversational language within about a year or two of starting to learn the language. But it takes a lot longer, typically at least 5 years, sometimes much longer than that, for students to catch up in the academic aspects of the language. And we can talk in a little bit about why that is. But what that means is that even in school contexts where we do have access to specialized language teachers, typically those teachers will work with students, newly arrived students, in the early stages of acquisition. They'll maybe provide some support for the first year, sometimes a little bit longer. but students require support for much longer to catch up. And so it's not a matter of just having the school having a mindset that the specialized language teacher, the Finnish as a second language teacher, for example, is going to solve the problem, because all teachers need to have access to the instructional strategies that are required to help students understand instruction and pick up the languages, the academic language, as quickly as possible. So this obviously points to some professional development that teachers need, but it also points to what principals need to do. Because if principals, school leaders generally, are not familiar with what the research is saying, they're not in a position to help their teachers to acquire that knowledge. They're not in a position to work with teachers in terms of professional development, to focus them on what kind of strategies they can use. So a first point that we need to emphasize is that school principals need to have access to what the research is saying about patterns of academic language learning among second language students. Another piece of evidence that's very relevant to what we do in school concerns students' first languages. In many contexts, there's still a sort of suspicion in relation to students' first languages. Teachers and sometimes school leaders, sometimes psychologists, feel that if parents continue to speak their first language in the home with their students, they're taking away time that could be spent learning the school language. And in the past, it was quite common in Canada and elsewhere for teachers to suggest to parents that they should try to switch to the school language in the home. This can have disastrous effects because parents are likely not fluent in the school language. They're learning it at the same time as their children are learning it. And so the quality of communication between parents and children is likely to decline. And what we know from this context is that when students and parents no longer have a language in common, when in cases where parents do stop using their home language and grandparents stop using their home language with children, there's much less richness in the interaction going on in the home. And this leads to less conceptual development in the home language, and students tend to do worse under those conditions than when parents focus on building up a strong conceptual foundation in the first language that then can be transferred to the second language. And what the research shows very clearly is that students who continue to develop their first language, to continue to develop literacy in their first language as they're learning the second language, do much better in school. And so again, this is the kind of knowledge that school leaders need to have if they're going to provide instructional leadership for their teachers. So rather than the school prohibiting students from using their first language, discouraging them from developing it, they should be doing the opposite. They should be recognizing students' multilingual skills, communicating to students that knowledge of additional languages has always been an important feature of educated people, and communicating to parents that if they want to help their child in school, read to them in the home language if possible, if they have access to books, spend a lot of time talking to them, extend their conceptual horizons, talk to them about things that are important within their communities, within their cultures, and build up the students' knowledge of the home language at the same time as they're acquiring the school language. Again, this is knowledge that school principals need to have if they're going to provide instructional leadership. So when we look at some of the competencies or skills and knowledge that school leaders need to have, they need to know what the research is saying. They need to know that there's a big difference between acquiring conversational skills in a language and the challenges involved for students in catching up academically in the language. There's a big difference between those two kinds of language. They also need to know that when we look at academic language, the low frequency words, the less common grammatical constructions that exist in text, one of the implications of that is that we need to encourage students to read as much as possible, because there are two places where students gain access to academic language. One is in classrooms, and secondly in printed texts. So students who are being read to in the home before they come to school, who have a lot of access to books at the preschool level, who join a school community in the early stages where books are part of what is being shared between teachers and students, where students can bring home books to read to their parents, or vice versa. Those students have a huge advantage in catching up academically. And so teachers and school principals need to know that books are important. Encouraging students to gain access to printed text is a crucial aspect of accelerating that catch-up process. And thirdly, they need to know that students' first languages are not the enemy. Students' first languages are the foundation upon which we build knowledge of the second language. And seeing multilingualism as something positive is basically the direction that the research suggests we should be moving in. And in recent years in schools in Canada, in Ireland, in numerous parts of Europe, schools have been taking on a different perspective in relation to how they view students' first language. They're encouraging students to use their first language in addition to the school language. As they do projects with older students, they're encouraging them to carry out research using the internet and using their first language. And they're encouraging students to develop literacy in that language at the same time as they're developing literacy in the school language. Because what the research shows very clearly is that the stronger students develop literacy in the home language, the better the foundation is for acquiring literacy in the second language, in the school language, because there's a lot of transfer of concepts and knowledge across languages. So a first point to keep in mind in terms of the knowledge and competencies that school leaders need to have is that they need to be aware of the key aspects of the research evidence that's out there, because many of their teachers in their schools will not have had the opportunity to acquire this knowledge, and so they're not going to acquire it unless the principal highlights the fact that this knowledge is important and works with teachers to extend that knowledge throughout the school. The second point is that when we look at schools that succeed extremely well in helping all students to succeed academically, these are schools that have gone beyond thinking of solutions as just adding on little bits and pieces, adding Finnish as a second language teachers, adding home language teachers for maybe an hour a week or an hour, 2 hours a week, whatever the context might be. Those additions are important, but what's much more powerful is when the entire school sees itself as being responsible for the learning of all students in the school. And when all teachers, not just the language specialist teacher, takes on the responsibility of acquiring the kinds of instructional strategies that will help students to understand instruction and to catch up academically. And some of these instructional strategies involve what researchers have called scaffolding. Scaffolding refers to the structures that workers who are working, for example, on a house or on a building use to get higher, to reach places where they couldn't go before. And that metaphor has been used to talk about the kind of support that teachers can provide students to help them understand instruction. So we're talking about a toolkit of instructional strategies that will include things like using graphic organizers or diagrams to communicate concepts. For example, Venn diagrams communicate the commonalities and the unique aspects of particular ideas or concepts. Timelines, again, communicate knowledge in ways that are visual rather than just relying on the language. So there's a toolkit of strategies like this that language specialist teachers will have had the opportunity to acquire as they acquire their qualifications, their knowledge of how to support students in acquiring the language. But many mainstream teachers will not have had the opportunity to acquire these strategies. And they're not difficult to acquire. A lot of them are fairly common sense. But unless the school principal highlights the fact that there is a knowledge base out there that we need to be aware of, and there's a set of instructional strategies that can be powerful in helping students to catch up academically unless the school leaders highlight the fact that collectively as a school we need to acquire this knowledge. Then it's likely that teachers will continue not to have the opportunity to acquire this knowledge. And as I said, when we look at the trajectories that students follow in catching up academically is a relatively long process. Typically, on average, at least 5 years is required. And as I said, sometimes much longer. There are two reasons why it takes longer for students to catch up in academic aspects of the language compared to conversational aspects. One is that academic aspects are more complex in many ways. We gain access to them in a restricted range of contexts. We find academic language in classrooms, and we find it in printed text. And so when we look at the implications of that, it means that we've got to maximize the time that we have in working with students in those contexts. But another reason why it takes a lot longer for students to catch up academically is that they're catching up to a moving target. Native Finnish-speaking students, or in the Canadian context, native English-speaking students are not standing still waiting for second language learners, newcomers, to catch up to them. Every year, they're expanding their vocabulary knowledge, they're expanding their reading skills, they're expanding their writing skills, they're expanding what they can do with language. And so in order to catch up, the immigrant background student needs to run faster. They need to not only acquire the content and acquire the language, but they need to catch up to students who are continuing to develop their knowledge of those languages. And so when teachers and school leaders are not aware of these trajectories, a lot of misinformation, a lot of misinterpretation of students' progress can happen. For example, in the past, it was quite common for teachers to be concerned about students who seemed to have acquired knowledge of the school language fairly well. If we look at, say, the Canadian context, I'll talk about English here. Teachers, after a couple of years, see students as becoming fluent in English. If they arrive at a young age, they sound like native English-speaking students, and yet teachers are concerned because they're not making the kind of progress that they would hope for in reading. They're far behind in terms of reading skills, writing skills. And so teachers have often wondered, does this child have a learning disability? Should this child be receiving special education help? In one study that I was able to do quite a number of years ago, I analysed more than 400 teacher referral forms, the forms that teachers filled out to refer children for psychological assessment. And I was also able to analyse the psychological assessments. And what came out of that was the fact that teachers often felt that students had a learning problem. When they went to the psychologist didn't realize often that the student was from a non-English speaking background because they seemed to be relatively fluent in the language. They gave IQ tests to the students with kind of verbal components and non-verbal components, and typically they found a big gap between the non-verbal components and the verbal components, and they often interpreted this as being indicative of a learning disability, whereas in fact in most cases it was probably just a normal process of catching up academically. So if we're not aware of these trajectories and the differences between academic language and conversational language, we can misinterpret test results or students' progress in class. And again, this highlights the fact that school leaders need to be aware of this knowledge. The final point that I'll make is that when we look at how school leaders who are aware of the research can help their schools to transform their orientation to teaching all students and seeing students not as having a problem because they're coming in with a language other than Finnish, but having a potential advantage. We need to be aware that this has to be a collaborative process at the school level. We need to adopt leadership orientations where it's not a top-down process. It's not the principal saying, here's what we're going to do. It's a discussion amongst teachers in the school together with the principal about how do we address the learning needs and the learning opportunities that students from multilingual backgrounds present to us? The school leader can bring in research knowledge that she or he is aware of. They can find resource people in the universities who can come and work with teachers in terms of strategies that could be used. All of this knowledge is out there, but it needs to be a process where everybody buys into it. And so part of the skill set that school principals need to have is to set up a collaborative relationship with teachers so that everybody can buy into the process, everybody can invest in expanding their skill set so that they are better able to support students in acquiring their second language, acquiring the school language, and catching up academically. And sometimes this is called distributed leadership in the school, or collaborative leadership, or shared leadership. And it works much better than a top-down, more autocratic process. So having that kind of leadership style, I think, will work much better in transforming the entire school so that we move away from a mindset where teaching newcomer students and teaching immigrant background students is seen as the job of the second language teacher or the language specialist teacher, to being something that is part of the mandate, part of the responsibility and part of the opportunities that the entire school takes on. And that raises issues that go beyond just instruction, because in many countries across Europe, there's a pushback against immigration. There's a pushback against accepting asylum seekers, and it's normal that many teachers might also have some concerns about the fact that if there's a lot of immigrant background students coming into their classrooms, the quality of instruction might get diluted, that they have to spend more time with these students than they're used to spending with students who are fluent in the language. And I think when we look at some of the case studies that have been done of schools that have taken up that challenge and seen it not as a problem, but as an opportunity, seeing students' languages and their cultural knowledge as a resource that they bring into the school context, then wonderful things can happen in these schools. And I would encourage everybody to look at some of these case studies and see the enriched opportunities that accrue to all students from having access to multiple perspectives, multiple cultural experiences, and multiple languages in the school context. And one of the issues that has been raised in the new Finnish national curriculum is the importance of developing students' awareness of how language works and building that awareness of language across the curriculum into the disciplines, so that when we're teaching science, we're not just teaching the language of science, we're not just teaching the content, we're teaching the language of science. And so if we look at our mandate from the national curriculum to build up students' language awareness, we have much more opportunity to do that when we have a multitude of languages in our classrooms that we can draw on. And again, there are case studies of schools in different countries that have shown how this can happen in powerful ways. And so it's the school leader's role to orchestrate this process, to work respectfully, obviously, with all the teachers in the school, to involve the community and children's parents as much as possible in the process, to communicate clearly to students and to their families that knowledge of their home languages is a resource for them. It's the language they use within the family, the language they use within the community. It's a language that will be useful for them personally, economically, as they go through their lives. And within the school, we should be communicating that message explicitly to students and encouraging them to develop their literacy skills in that language as well as in Finnish, because the two languages help each other when we set them up as friends rather than enemies. So those are some of the issues that school principals are facing in, not just in Finland obviously, but in countries across Europe and in North America. And the data that have come from schools that have taken on a whole school orientation to this show that very powerful pedagogies can result when we look at students' languages as something that is potentially enriching rather than a problem. So thank you.